This is not merely a critique of a book, but of a broader intellectual current, one that reinterprets fairness through the lens of emotion rather than structure. The tyranny of merit doesn't originate this shift, it crystallizes it and offers it a moral rationale. Every age has its literature to justify its drift. This is one of them, and it warrants serious challenge. Welcome behind the veil. In the landscape we think, in stillness we converse. Michael Sandel's The Tyranny of Merit claims to expose the moral flaws of meritocracy. In truth, it exposes something else. What happens when a complex idea is attacked using a straw man and reduced to a philosophical spectacle? At its core, Sandel's argument rests on a flawed definition of meritocracy, one that turns a useful concept into a moral scapegoat. What he offers is not a critical of real-world systems, but an indictment of a caricature. Before we can even begin to debate meritocracy, we have to ask, what exactly is Sandel attacking? Because if you build your argument on a straw man, it doesn't matter how eloquent you are. The whole thing burns down. Let's start there. Sandel defines meritocracy as the belief that people deserve whatever success they achieve, and therefore also deserve their failures. He paints this as a toxic moral ideology that leads to arrogance among the winners and humiliation for the rest. But this is not what meritocracy means. Properly understood, meritocracy is a decision-making principle. It's how individuals evaluate each other, how institutions allocate opportunities, and how societies select people for roles based on observable ability, effort, and performance. It's about creating a fair structure for choice, not assigning existential worth to people. By twisting meritocracy into a moral philosophy of blame and reward, Sandel misses the real debate: how we evaluate merit, not whether we should. So no, meritocracy isn't the problem. Twisting it into a moral judgment is. But Sandel doesn't stop there. He confuses unfair starting points with the failure of merit itself, and that's where the next mistake begins. Michael Sandel writes, it's unclear what merit means in a society where the successful have often had access to elite schools, private tutors, and well-connected internships, advantages they didn't earn from the tyranny of merit. Michael Sandel. This is a common critique, that because some individuals begin life with more resources, better schools, tutors, or family support, rewarding their success is inherently unfair. But this claim misunderstands both the nature of fairness and the function of merit. Let's clarify a few key points. First, unequal starting points don't invalidate just outcomes. If a student from a wealthy family receives good early education and ultimately gets into an Ivy League school, this student has done nothing wrong. They didn't choose to be born into privilege. This was, to use Sandel's own framing, luck. But they did choose to study hard, perform well, and meet the standards required for possible admission. These achievements are not morally compromised just because they were supported by favorable conditions. To say their success is unjust simply because of their own background would mean punishing someone for circumstances beyond their control. Ironically, the very thing Sandel claims to oppose. 2. Wealth doesn't guarantee success. More importantly, wealth doesn't guarantee merit. While a wealthy student may have access to more resources, this doesn't mean they automatically gain admission to top schools or positions of power. In fact, many wealthy families inadvertently disadvantage their children through overprotection, indulgence, or unrealistic pressure. Privilege can spoil judgment, dull motivation, or distort values. There's no linear relationship between wealth and competence. A privileged starting point may offer opportunities, but it cannot substitute for discipline, ability, and persistence. 3. Merit is not a zero-sum game. Sandel also implies that when a wealthy or advantaged student succeeds, they displace a more deserving poor student. But this assumes that institutions only have one seat at the table, or that success is a zero-sum game. Top schools don't admit students by subtracting one merit to give another. They look at absolute standards. A candidate must be qualified, regardless of background, if two students, one rich, one poor, both meet those standards, both can be admitted. This doesn't mean we ignore inequality. It means we don't confuse social background with moral culpability, or assume that the existence of privilege invalidates the principle or merit. 4. Merit is the only just standard. If we abandon merit simply because it's unevenly distributed at birth, we fall into a far worse injustice. Evaluating people by background instead of ability, that would mean rejecting a capable student simply because they are rich, which is every bit as prejudiced as rejecting one because they are poor. The right response to inequality is not to eliminate standards, but to help more people meet them. So, in concluding for this part, Sandel's argument implies that unequal starting points discredit meritocratic outcomes, but this confuses orange with the outcome. It treats privilege as a disqualifier even when individuals succeed through effort, growth, and actual capability. In truth, meritocracy remains the fairest and most humane way to reward contribution, regardless of class, rather than dismantle it. We should focus on expanding access to opportunity without distorting what merit actually means. So we arrive at a deeper tension, not between merit and justice, but between orange and outcome, effort and assumption. Yet, Sandel doesn't end with systems. He turns to the soul. He shifts from structure to culture, from how we rise to how we feel about rising. And in that shift, the confusion becomes profound. Michael Sandel argues that meritocracy fosters arrogance among the successful and humiliation among those who struggle. He writes, meritocratical hubris leads to the winners to inhale too deeply of their success and forget the luck and grace that helped them on their way. This is an emotional resonant claim, but it doesn't hold up under rational scrutiny. It conflates cultural attitudes with structural injustice, and then proposes dismantling the system that enables contribution and excellence, just to address emotional discomfort. Let's unpack the flaws in this line of reasoning. First, is arrogance inherently wrong or merely human? Yes, arrogant elites exist, just as arrogant poor people do. But is arrogance in itself unjust? Or is it simply a part of a human personality that we tolerate in a free society? In fact, a truly free society must allow room for arrogance, just as it allows for anger, pride, and self-expression. As the philosopher, possibly Karl Popper or someone in classical liberal tradition once said, maximum freedom means even allowing hatred, as long as it causes no harm. Emotional expression, whether arrogance or confidence, is not a crime. It can be annoying, even distasteful. But this is a cultural issue, not a justice issue. Moreover, the idea that all successful people become arrogant is simply false. Most genuinely accomplished individuals, Jeffrey Hinton, Elon Musk, Larry Page, Steve Jobs, frequently credit others, work in teams, and build ecosystems of collaboration. Humility is often a key feature of long-term elite success, not its enemy. Yes, some grow arrogant, but arrogance usually carries consequences. Overconfidence leads to failure, and when it does, reality humbles people. That's not a meritocracy feeling, that's a natural correction mechanism. If someone becomes truly disconnected from society, their relevance and power erode. Number 2. Students and institutions, whose responsibility is humility. Sandel suggests that Ivy League students become arrogant and detached. But if a student goes to a great school and comes out arrogant, this is a failure of the institution's education, not the student's merit. After all, they're still learning. Humility, like math or ethics, can be taught. That's the job of educators, not a fault of merit-based selection. It's incoherent to blame a student for arrogance, then simultaneously claiming all success is luck. If it's luck, there's nothing to be arrogant about. If it's not, then perhaps the person earned their status, and arrogance is just a passing personality flaw. In short, this is not a structural problem, it's a cultural one. If we want to cultivate humble elites, then reform cultural narratives and educational values. Don't destroy the systems that identify and elevate capable people. Number 3. What about the humiliation of the unsuccessful? Sandel paints a picture of unsuccessful feeling shame, resentment, and division. But again, he applies a double standard. If all success is luck, why isn't failure simply interpreted as bad luck? Why is the emotional burden so heavily placed on one side? More importantly, every system of evaluation inevitably has those who reckon that's unavoidable. But the solution is not to erase standards, it's to ensure those standards are fair, broad, and inclusive of different talents. Consider this a simple example. Would you rather be operated on by a doctor from a top medical school with rigorous standards, or someone from a low-standard institution? Would you fly with a pilot who passed difficult certifications, or one who failed basic tests? Standards exist not to humiliate, but to protect, enable, and ensure competence. And even in education, imagine assigning an unqualified student who loves art into a math-intensive engineering program. The result isn't justice, it's sabotage, both for the individual and for the field. Removing merit won't reduce humiliation, it will increase dysfunction. Number 4. We don't need to worship Ivy Leagues, we need to broaden what merit means. Sandel is right that society can overly glorify narrow symbols of success, like Ivy League's degrees. But the answer isn't to eliminate evaluation, it's to expand it. Institutions can and should honor a wide range of achievements, artistic brilliance, civic leadership, entrepreneurial risk-taking, skilled trades, and community care. That's the real reform. Honor diverse kinds of merit, not abandon the very concept. In short conclusion for this part, the problem isn't meritocracy, it's the emotional and cultural story we wrap around success. Arrogance is a human trait, not a structural crime. Humiliation stems from a narrow conception of success, not from merit-based systems themselves. Sandel's proposal tries to solve an emotional discomfort by undermining the structural principle that gives society direction, trust, and excellence. We can teach humility, we can cultivate perspective, but if we discard standards, we don't become a more just society. we become a confused one. So the problem isn't merit, it's the meaning we attach to it. Sandel mistakes emotional discomfort for structural injustice. Arrogance and shame are cultural shadows, not systemic flaws. But instead of deepening our emotional maturity, Sandel would have us dismantle the very structure that drives excellence. That brings us to what's ignored in this debate: the collective value of merit, innovation, incentives, progress. Let's talk about that. While Michael Sandel fixates on the emotional side effects of meritocracy, arrogance, humiliation, status anxiety, he misses its core function as an engine of innovation and collective progress. As economist Tanner Cowen points out, Sandel radically underestimates the civic and economic value of rewarding talent and effort. In a world where skill, discipline, and creativity are not meaningfully incentivized, progress stalls. If success is decoupled from competence, why strive at all? Why take the risk, make the sacrifice, or build the next big thing? Meritocracy isn't just about individual reward, it's the structural mechanism by which we allocate responsibility, advance technology, and solve collective problems. It distributes opportunity according to capability, and in doing so, multiplies value for everyone. Let's dive into the details. First, meritocracy is not zero-sum, it's value generating. Sandel often assumes a zero-sum view of success, that if someone wins, others must lose. But this is not how innovation works. When a brilliant engineer designs a safe bridge, the public wins. When a scientist finds a vaccine, the world benefits. When an entrepreneur like Elon Musk takes extraordinary risks to build Tesla and SpaceX, it generates value that reverberates across the economy through partners, employees, suppliers, and customers. Musk, for example, didn't merely enrich himself. He bet nearly his entire fortune on Tesla when it was so close to collapse. Few billionaires with over $100 million would take that risk. Most protect their wealth. When Tesla had only 1 week of funding left, his support came not from public subsidies or institutional elites, but from old friends and loyal partners. In return, he rewarded them with meaningful ownership, success, and purpose. That's not arrogance, it's courage, loyalty, and gratitude in action. Number 2. The poor benefit most from innovation. Ironically, a system that discourages talent and productivity in the name of fairness harms the poor more than anyone else. Innovation reduces costs, creates jobs, and expands access from cheap smartphones to electric vehicles to open access education. The products of merit-based systems ultimately democratized. Without incentives for capable individuals to excel, society becomes stagnant, and the disadvantaged are the first to suffer. It's not feelings that feed people, cure disease, or create opportunity. It's competence applied at scale, and that's what meritocracy empowers. So, conclusion to this part, by sidelining the role of innovation, entrepreneurship, and technical excellence, Sandel's critique ignores the real-world benefits of rewarding merit. His focus on emotional harm obscures the profound public good produced by people who are capable, driven, and willing to take extraordinary risks. Meritocracy, when done right, doesn't just serve the winners, it elevates the whole society. So merit isn't just fair, it's fruitful, it builds, it lifts. But Sandel's solution, it trades the structure for sentiment. After all the critique, What he offers isn't reform, it's a retreat. And that's where the real problem begins. After spending hundreds of pages critiquing meritocracy's emotional and moral consequences, Sandel pivots to his proposed remedy: next sorting, more lotteries, and a new kind of civic humility. But this shift reveals something more troubling. His confusion between individual virtue and systemic design, between public fairness and private character. Instead of reforming meritocratic mechanisms where they fail, such as unequal access to early education or wages separation in essential sectors, Sandel leans into vague cultural prescription that we should be more humble, less competitive, more grateful, more collectively oriented. But when abstract moral tone becomes public policy, the result is not justice, it's confusion and resentment. When you replace evaluation with randomness, you don't correct injustice, you erode competence. So instead of fixing what's broken, Sandel reached for moral fog, virtues in place of systems, sentiment in place of structure. But nowhere in this confusion more obvious than in his so-called dignity of work argument. Let's unpack that next. Sandel argues that meritocracy devalues no status labor, that society views janitors, drivers, or retail workers as lesser because they didn't succeed in the meritocratic race. But this misdiagnoses the actual problem. The real issue is not meritocracy, it's institutional failure to reward dignity through wages, visibility, and civic participation. It's not that truck drivers lack merit, it's that our economic and political systems have failed to reflect their importance structurally. This doesn't require dismantling standards. It requires a cultural and policy-level maturity, valuing diverse contributions while acknowledging skill differences. Value is subjective, an Austrian economics perspective. From the Austrian School of Economics, particularly thinkers like Karl Menger and Ludwig Mises, value is not intrinsic. It's subjective and arises from individual preferences in specific contexts. That means a CEO and a janitor are not unequal in moral worth, but their economic contributions are valued differently by markets, based on scarcity, skill, and demand. This isn't cruelty, it's realism. Trying to equalize value by force destroys the informational function of prices and incentives, as Austrian economists have long warned. As to Sandel's solution, it's more like a confused mixture of morality and policy. Sandel proposes civic humility as a corrective to meritocratic excess. But humility is a personal virtue, not a political program. You cannot legislate it, institutionalize it, or measure it meaningfully. Whether someone is humble is not a public issue. It's a matter of personal character, not collective governance. To claim that a society must become humble is to make a category error, blurring the line between moral aspiration and policy design. Moreover, by constantly invoking elites in a tone of quiet contempt, Sandel's book encourages moralized resentment. Instead of helping people understand structures or build competence, it invites envy and tribalism. This is not civic empowerment. It's cultural sabotage masquerading as a philosophy. In conclusion for this part, a book that fails its own standard, Sandel's The Tyranny of Merit is a book that ironically fails on meritocratic grounds. It tries to address too many questions: economics, ethics, religion, education, culture, and collapses under the weight of its ambition. It's philosophically thin, conceptually inconsistent, and structurally disorganized. Calling it literary trash is not about the tone, it's about standards. By the very criteria Sandel asks us to abandon: clarity, logic, evidence, coherence, his work falls short, not because it lacks compassion, but because it refuses to think rigorously about how justice, merit, and freedom actually interact in real life. A just society should encourage humility, but also reward excellence, uphold standards, and recognize that aspiration is not tyranny, it's human nature. Finally, to move forward, we need less blame, more structure. That's the real debate. What Sandel calls the tyranny of merit is not a tyranny at all. It's simply the reality of structural evaluation, a system where effort, ability, and contribution matter. This is not an operation. This is how society escapes the actual tyrannies of nepotism, tribal favoritism, and ideological quotas. By contrast, Sandel's framework risks creating a new kind of soft tyranny, the tyranny of moral sentiment. In this view, ambition becomes shameful, success becomes suspect, and competence must justify itself emotionally rather than practically. But institutions are not therapists. Their job is not to validate our feelings, it's to make sound, fair, and forward-looking decisions based on merit, contribution, and consequences. True fairness is not about flattening differences. It's about structuring society so that excellence, whenever it appears, is rewarded for the benefit of all. And that requires moral seriousness, not moral sentimentality. In conclusion, meritocracy, in its true form, is not a morality tale. It's a pragmatic method of evaluation. It enables societies to allocate opportunities based on demonstrated competence, aligning fairness with excellence. Of course, the system is not perfect. We can and should expand access, correct biases, and recognize diverse forms of contribution. But that's a call to improve the practice, not abandon the principle. Sandel claims to critical meritocracy, but what he actually attacks is a distorted fiction of it, a moralized caricature where success equals virtue and failure equals shame. That's not how real meritocratic systems work, nor how they should be defended. His arguments confuse emotional discomfort with structural injustice and offer sentiments where serious policy thinking is needed. In doing so, he risks discrediting one of the few tools modern societies have to ensure accountability, reward innovation, and resist corruption. Yes, let's broaden our standards, deepen our respect, and teach humility. But let's also be clear: merit is not tyranny, and fairness is not the same as emotional equality. The solution lies not in dismantling meritocracy, but in making it more inclusive, more rigorous, and more humane. I'm not just criticizing Sandel's book. I'm challenging an entire worldview that dresses sentiment up as justice and replaces rigor with resentment. Sandel critiques a myth, but the real danger is happening off the page, in broad rooms, on campuses, and in policy rooms. where standards are quietly eroded in the name of fairness, freedom, and identity starts to override competence. That's where we go next.